A Short History of the United States by Edward Channing. Chapter 2. Spanish and French Pioneers in the United States. 10. Stories of Golden Lands. Wherever the Spaniards went, the Indians always told them stories of golden lands somewhere else. The Bahama Indians, for instance, told their cruel Spanish masters of a wonderful land toward the north. Not only was there gold in that land, there was also a fountain whose waters restored youth and vigor to the drinker. Among the fierce Spanish soldiers was Ponce de Leon. He determined to see for himself if these stories were true. 11. Discovery of Florida, 1513. In the same year that Balboa discovered the Pacific Ocean, Ponce de Leon sailed northward and westward from the Bahamas. On Easter Sunday, 1513, he anchored off the shores of a new land. The Spanish name for Easter was La Pascua de Flores. So, de Leon called the new land Florida. For the Spaniards were a very religious people and usually named their lands and the settlements from saints or religious events. De Leon then sailed around the southern end of Florida and back to the West Indies. In 1521, he visited Florida again and was wounded by an Indian arrow and returned home to die. 12. Spanish Voyages and Conquests. Spanish sailors and conquerors now appeared in quick succession on the northern and western shores of the Gulf of Mexico. One of them discovered the mouth of the Mississippi. Others of them stole Indians and carried them to the islands to work as slaves. The most famous of them all was Cortez. In 1519, he conquered Mexico after a thrilling campaign and found there great store of gold and silver. This discovery led to more expeditions and to the exploration of the southern half of the United States. 13. Coronado in the Southwest, 1540 to 1542. In 1540, Coronado set out from the Spanish towns on the Gulf of California to seek for more gold and silver. For 73 days he journeyed northward until he came to the pueblos of the Southwest. These pueblos were huge buildings of stone and sun-dried clay. Some of them were large enough to shelter 300 Indian families. Pueblos are still to be seen in Arizona and New Mexico, and the Indians living in them, even to this day, tell stories of Coronado's coming and of his cruelty. There was hardly any gold and silver in these cities, so a great grief fell upon Coronado and his comrades. 14. The Great Plains. Soon, however, a new hope came to the Spaniards, for an Indian told them that far away in the north there really was a golden land. Onward rode Coronado and a body of picked men. They crossed vast plains where there were no mountains to guide them. For more than 1,000 miles they rode on until they reached eastern Kansas. Everywhere they found great herds of buffaloes, or wild cows, as they called them. They also met the Indians of the plains. Unlike the Indians of the pueblos, these Indians lived in tents made of buffalo hides, stretched upon poles. Everywhere there were plains, buffaloes, and Indians. Nowhere was there gold or silver. Broken-hearted, Coronado and his men rode southward to their old homes in Mexico. 15. De Soto in the southeast, 1539 to 1543. In 1539, a Spanish army landed at Tampa Bay on the western coast of Florida. The leader of this army was De Soto, one of the conquerors of Peru. He was very fond of the sport of killing Indians and was also greedy for gold and silver. From Tampa, he marched northward to South Carolina and then marched southwestward to Mobile Bay. There he had a dreadful time, for the Indians burned his camp and stores and killed many of his men. From Mobile he wandered northwestward until he came to a great river. It was the Mississippi, and it was so wide that a man standing on one bank could not see a man standing on the opposite bank. Some of De Soto's men penetrated westward nearly to the line of Coronado's march, but the two bands did not meet. De Soto died and was buried in the Mississippi. Those of his men who still lived built a few boats and managed to reach the Spanish settlements in Mexico. 16. Other Spanish expeditions. Many other Spanish explorers visited the shores of the United States before 1550. Some sailed along the Pacific coast, others sailed along the Atlantic coast. The Spaniards also made several attempts to found settlements both on the northern shore of the Gulf of Mexico and on Chesapeake Bay. But all these early attempts ended in failure. In 1550, there were no Spaniards on the continent within the present limits of the United States, except possibly a few traders and missionaries in the Southwest. 17. Early French voyages, 1524 to 1536. The first French expedition to America was led by an Italian named Verrazano, but he sailed in the service of Francis I, King of France. He made his voyage in 1524 and sailed along the coast from the Cape Fear River to Nova Scotia. He entered New York Harbor and spent 2 weeks in Newport Harbor. He reported that the country was as pleasant as it is possible to conceive. The next French expedition was led by a Frenchman named Cartier. In 1534, he visited the Gulf of St. Lawrence. In 1535, he sailed up the St. Lawrence River to Montreal. But before he could get out of the river again, the ice formed about his ships. He and his crew had to pass the winter there. They suffered terribly, and 24 of them perished of cold and sickness. In the spring of 1536, the survivors returned to France. 18. The French in Carolina, 1562. The French next explored the shores of the Carolinas. Ribault was the name of their commander. Sailing southward from Carolina, he discovered a beautiful river and called it the River of May, but we know it by its Spanish name of St. John's. He left a few men on the Carolina coast and returned to France. A year or more those men remained. Then, wearying of their life in the wilderness, they built a crazy boat with sails of shirts and sheets and steered for France. Soon their water gave out, and then their food. Finally, almost dead, they were rescued by an English ship. 19. The French in Florida, 1564 to 65. While these Frenchmen were slowly drifting across the Atlantic, a great French expedition was sailing to Carolina. Finding Ribault's men gone, the new colony was planted on the banks of the River of May. Soon the settlers ate up all the food they had brought with them. Then they brought food from the Indians, giving them toys and old clothes in exchange. Some of the colonists rebelled. They seized a vessel and sailed away to plunder the Spaniards in the West Indies. They told the Spaniards of the colony on the River of May, and the Spaniards resolved to destroy it. 20. The Spaniards in Florida, 1565. For this purpose, the Spaniards sent out an expedition under Menendez. He sailed to the River of May and found Ribault there with a French fleet. So he turned southward and, going ashore, founded St. Augustine. Ribault followed, but a terrible storm drove his whole fleet ashore south of St. Augustine. Menendez then marched overland to the French colony. He surprised the colonists and killed nearly all of them. Then, going back to St. Augustine, he found Ribault and his shipwrecked sailors and killed nearly all of them. In this way ended the French attempts to found a colony in Carolina and Florida. But St. Augustine remained and is today the oldest town on the mainland of the United States.